Welcome to this special interview sponsored by the Word on Fire Institute. My name is Brandon Vogt. I'm the Senior Content Director here at Word on Fire, and I am delighted to be joined by my good and longtime friend, Dr. Holly Ordway. Holly, welcome.
Well, thank you. This is just such a pleasure to be talking with you about Tolkien.
I'm pumped about it too. You and I have been talking about this book that you've been working on for, gosh, almost a decade here. It's like giving birth to a baby that's gestated for years and years and years. And so I'm just thrilled that after lots of private conversations you and I have had about it, we finally get to have an in-depth public discussion about this exciting new book. Before we get to the book, let me offer everybody a brief biographical take on Holly. Holly is the Fellow of Faith and Culture at our Word on Fire Institute. She's also a visiting professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University. She holds a PhD in English from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Holly is a published poet. She's also the author of a couple of books before the one we're going to talk about today. Those two past books are Apologetics and the Christian Imagination, an integrated approach to defending the faith, and her conversion memoir titled Not God's Type, an atheist academic lays down her arms. Holly is probably best known, though, as an expert on the Inklings, especially J.R.R. Tolkien and Charles Williams. She's contributed chapters to several Inklings-related volumes, including C.S. Lewis at Poets' Corner, The Inklings and King Arthur, and The Story of the Cosmos. She's also a subject editor for the Journal of Inkling Studies, which I think is by far the number one Inklings-related publication in the world. So if you haven't subscribed to that, I encourage you to. However, her newest book, and the one we're going to be talking about today, is a groundbreaking volume titled Tolkien's Modern Reading. You'll see a picture of it on the screen there. Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages. This book is the very first book in our new Word on Fire academic line from Word on Fire Publishing, and we just could not be more thrilled to publish this book by this author. Holly, maybe let's start with that point. Can you say a few words about this new Word on Fire academic line, which your book is not only inaugurating, but as a fellow of the Word on Fire Institute, you've had some input in shaping this new academic line. I'm assuming you're just as excited as the rest of us are about this.
Possibly even more, because I'm extremely excited about this. I mean, it's kind of a daunting and exciting thing to be the book that leading off this line. But I'm very proud to be doing it because the whole idea is just to produce top-notch academic content, things that are really, bringing new insights into the world, but also doing it in a way that is accessible to readers. And I think that's really important as an academic, that we need to be doing, really in-depth, well-sourced, thought-out work. Tolkien's Modern Reading has more than 1,000 endnotes with all the citations. The bibliography alone is 10,000 words. So we're really doing deep work, but it's also been a real emphasis of my whole scholarly career to make those things be work that can be read and enjoyed by anyone who's interested in the author. No jargon, just really engaging with these ideas. And I'm just excited that Word on Fire Academic really grasps that vision and has allowed me to do things like have a photo gallery. I'm so excited. I have a photo gallery, full color, more than 40 images in it. So this is all very exciting.
I remember, I'm not sure if I even told you this, but I remember during the editing process, two of our editors who admitted they really didn't have much experience with Tolkien. I'm not even sure if they had read Lord of the Rings, but they said they found the book intriguing from page 1 to page 370 something, whatever it is. So it's the type of academic book that does break new ground in the world of scholarship, but also is accessible and interesting to people who maybe aren't in that niche yet. Before we get to the book, I want to talk a little bit more about J.R.R. Tolkien himself. Tell us, how did you first get on the J.R.R. Tolkien train, and why have you decided to make him such a central focus of your academic work?
Well, he's really been almost a lifetime interest for me because I read The Hobbit and then The Lord of the Rings when I was still a little girl, and have become part of my sort of imaginative furniture of my own life. And then when I was a teenager, I came across a battered copy of the Tolkien Reader in a used bookstore somewhere, and it has his essay on fairy stories in it. And that captivated me because it was my first taste of literary criticism. And so I can genuinely say that I've been thinking seriously about Tolkien as a literary critic for more than 30 years, because that was really my first engagement. It excited me to think that an author that I loved as an author for his stories was also using that brilliant mind to think about how do stories work. And at, 14 or 15, that was a tremendous, insight. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that I ended up studying English literature. I originally, when I went to graduate school, I thought I was going to be a medievalist, again, following in the footsteps of Tolkien, but then shifted that I wanted to work on modern fantasy literature, did my dissertation on fantasy, centered really on Lord of the Rings. So he's sort of been with me throughout my whole academic career. And that essay on fairy stories not only kind of inspired me to think about being a literary critic, but it gave me that vision about a literary critical approach that values the work that it's looking at. And that has been really at the heart of my work, that I want always my study to be appreciative and enriching, that we don't just pull something apart and then leave it, dead on the page. I want everything that I do, that I'm writing about Tolkien and his work, to lead people to appreciate his work more by the end of it. And I think I'm trying to follow Tolkien's own footsteps in the way that he approached the genre of fantasy.
Well, let's talk now about this exciting new book. So again, it's titled Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages. And I think viewers can probably guess from that title that the main way that this book is groundbreaking is because you contest the common assumption that Tolkien was dismissive of modern culture, that The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were primarily based on medieval legends or Norse mythology or Icelandic languages. One early reviewer of The Lord of the Rings described the book as perhaps the last literary masterpiece of the Middle Ages. Others have described Tolkien as an arch-conservative. Another reviewer described him as a backward-looking person. And again, the common assumption, I think, for most Tolkien readers and scholars is that he kind of didn't like anything that smacked of the modern day. But you argue that Tolkien was actually a much broader reader than commonly assumed. So he had read more widely in terms of genre, but that he was also quite familiar with contemporary writers and books, mainly books from the last, say, century and a half. Tell us more about this basic contention or thesis of your book.
Yeah, I mean, when I started researching Tolkien, more than 10 years ago, researching this particular question, which really was, where did the Lord of the Rings come from? What had Tolkien read that helped feed into the Lord of the Rings? I went into that question assuming that it would be primarily medieval literature, and I was curious to see, was there anything more recent, maybe in the more modern fantasy authors that he had read? And then I kept finding more and more and more and more pieces of, like, he had read this, he had read that. And finally, there was a tipping point where I realized that that picture was simply incorrect, that it wasn't the case that he was dismissive of modern literature, because I just had this evidence in front of me. I couldn't ignore it. And I think it's important to stress that the picture of him as deeply engaged with the Middle Ages is true. I mean, that's a powerful part of the influence in all of his work. He was a medievalist, he was a philologist. Languages and medieval literature was hugely important, hugely influential in all of his writing. And I don't contest that. That's true. And there's a lot of great scholarship that explores that. But what I contest is the idea that that's the only thing he cared about, because that's false. It's really, I think my argument could be summed up as a yes and. Yes, he appreciated that medieval literature and it's important, but he also engaged with modern culture. And one, I think, critical insight was from one of his students who wrote an interview that I dug up in my research. He talks about Tolkien as a bridge or a translator between the medieval world and the modern world. And in that particular comment, he was talking about the way that Tolkien was able to explain Beowulf to his students in Oxford, that he was able to really make it come alive for them in the modern day. And it was like a light bulb went on in my brain. I said, you can't be a translator unless you know both languages. You can't be a bridge unless you got a foot on both sides of the stream. He couldn't have been such an effective translator of medieval literature. He couldn't have helped people engage with medieval literature so profoundly if he hadn't been able to make the connection to the modern day. How did he make that connection? By being interested in and involved in modern literature, modern culture. Now, did he like all of it? No. Did he approve of everything modern? No. But he also lived through World War I and World War II, which isn't exactly the high point of modernity. So I think we can excuse him for having, some negative views about certain issues of modern culture. But he's that bridge, he's that translator. And that, I think, is the underlying insight that really shaped Tolkien's modern reading.
Love that image of Tolkien as bridge, because again, the common assumption is Tolkien was a dam. He was holding back modernity from flowing, back and forth from the medieval period. Listen, let's talk about one of the earliest biographers of Tolkien. He's someone you focus heavily on in your book, named Humphrey Carpenter. Now, Carpenter knew Tolkien personally, and while he was writing his biography, he had access to a lot of the unpublished Tolkien papers. So this is why many people consider Carpenter's biography to be a magisterial source for Tolkien's life and his work, or at least, one of the most trusted sources out there. It's undoubtedly shaped what readers think about Tolkien today. But you raised some questions in your book about Carpenter's perception of Tolkien, particularly his claim, and I'm quoting Carpenter here. He says, Tolkien read very little modern fiction and took no serious notice of it. And, again, Carpenter, for him, English literature ended with Chaucer. Can you talk a little bit about Carpenter's views and the issues that you have with them?
Yes, and this is again one of the discoveries that I made because I, like every other Tolkien scholar that I know of, it treated Carpenter as, he's the authorized biographer, he's the editor of the letters, he's the go-to source. But really, it was in discovering that statement that he read very little modern fiction and took no serious notice of it. I mean, that's just simply incorrect. Factually, it's not true. The evidence is there that he did read widely and he did take serious notice of it, and he took a lot of notice of literature after Chaucer. So when I realized that Carpenter was boldly claiming something that was totally at odds with the evidence of Tolkien's own statements, because we're not talking about inferring influences from what he might have read. I'm talking about discovering what he actually read, that he mentions in his letters, that he mentions in interviews, things like that. So I started digging into, what did Humphrey Carpenter think? And I found a number of different interviews with Carpenter himself that were extremely revealing. And I discovered from Carpenter's own words that he was very dismissive of Tolkien. He disliked Tolkien. He makes snarky remarks about his academic work. He had a bad attitude towards the Inklings, even though he wrote a group biography of them. He's just very shockingly dismissive, like, I wouldn't even want to talk to them if I were back in Oxford in that day. Like, well, that's interesting. And I found out that he really had kind of an agenda about dealing with Tolkien's context, and including Tolkien's faith, but also Tolkien's role as an academic, because Carpenter was the son of the Bishop of Oxford, the Anglican Bishop of Oxford, but had become an atheist by age 21. And he had very conflicted feelings about the whole academic milieu, which make him interested in Tolkien in a way, but from a very kind of antagonistic angle. And it's interesting to note that his what he knew of Tolkien was relatively slight. He did meet him and talk to him a few times during Tolkien's life, but they were very brief meetings. He didn't know him well. And one of the saddest things I came upon was Carpenter recounting the last exchange that he had with Tolkien. He'd been trying to get Tolkien to agree to an interview, and there had been just difficulties with scheduling, and Carpenter sent him kind of a snappy note saying, well, I guess you're just bored by me and you don't want to talk to me. Carpenter himself admits this. This is his own admission. And Tolkien wrote back and said, no, I'm not at all bored by you. I'd love to meet with you. But they never did. So there's that kind of tension there. And then the way that he came about to be a biographer was very surprising to me. I had assumed that as authorized biographer, he had been carefully vetted and chosen by the Tolkien family. But in fact, they had picked him. He had just been a journalist for BBC Radio. They kind of knew him, and they asked him to help out with this photo album that became the Tolkien family album. Because as Tolkien's publisher commented, You don't need a whole lot of qualifications to write captions for pictures. But then he dug himself in. And then Carpenter himself says that he went round to all the Tolkien family members and said, well, if you don't pick me, who at least know a little bit about Tolkien, you might get somebody worse. And he almost like bullied them into picking him as a biographer. He writes the biography and he admits that he treated it as slapstick in the first draft. Christopher Tolkien pulled it to shreds when he got the draft and sent it back to Carpenter. And then Carpenter, in just like a week or two, cut all the parts that were, more contentious, and it was published. Now, as a writer, the fact that Carpenter pulled together the draft in under 2 years, even with his masses of information that he had, very unorganized, that is a little bit sort of surprising. And then the fact that he writes this sort of slapstick antagonistic biography that Christopher Tolkien rips apart, and it only takes him a week or two to do an entire revision. I don't think so. He just cut what was really annoying, and then they published the rest of it. So it's almost like a kind of happenstance that we have this author with a very sort of odd view of Tolkien ends up being the authorized biographer. Now, at the time, it probably didn't seem like that big of a deal because Tolkien wasn't the big name that he has become now. But the kind of shadow of Carpenter has fallen on all subsequent scholarship. And for a variety of reasons, people just went with it. They didn't really reckon with, well, what was his bias? What was his attitude? And a lot of the things in the biography are really his personal views presented as if they were well-sourced claims. So all of this is to say that this caused me to just really step back and say, okay, let me look fresh at Tolkien's personality and his reading habits from what Tolkien himself said and his friends and his family and his students, rather than going back to this biography that has issues.
Well, contra Humphrey Carpenter, you quote Clyde Kilby. Kilby also knew Tolkien and assisted him before Tolkien's death. Kilby said, and I'm quoting him, Tolkien was like an iceberg, something to be reckoned with above water in both its brilliance and mass, and yet much more below the surface. In your book, you kind of take this quote as maybe a central motif of how to understand Tolkien's reading habits, that maybe at the shallow, trivial level, the Carpenter perspective, it doesn't look like Tolkien engaged the modern world, but like an iceberg, the more you dig, the more that you discover he actually did.
Yeah, and partly, again, it's the Carpenter influence. People haven't looked at the evidence because they've assumed that, Tolkien didn't read anything modern, therefore I won't bother to look at what he did. And there have been scholars who have noted what he has read, but they've tended to assume that this was an exception. But there are so many exceptions. It's not a rule, really. But the Kilby interview was interesting because Kilby was an American, and he came to Oxford and more or less tried to help Tolkien with assembling the Silmarillion, late in Tolkien's life, and so he has a kind of a glimpse of Tolkien's working habits at that late stage of his life, and got to know him. And he was really struck by the complexity of Tolkien's personality. And that's something that I think has sometimes gotten a bit lost. People assume that he's a kind of a flattened image of this, backward-looking, nostalgic, hating the modern world kind of guy. But Kilby found him very complex, and in fact didn't quite know what to make of him. He said that he could characterize C.S. Lewis, but he couldn't characterize Tolkien. He just couldn't kind of grasp what his personality was like. It was so multifaceted. And this led me to really think about another aspect of Tolkien that I think has been overlooked, and that's his Englishness. Now, Kilby was an American, and many readers of Tolkien are Americans. I'm an American. But I have been going over and spending time in England for more than 10 years. I spend a couple months there every year. I've really gotten to know Oxford. I've gotten to know a lot of English people, and I found over time that this was giving me an insight into Tolkien himself, because there's that common saying that Americans and English people are separated by a common language. There are definitely different habits of communication, and one of these is understatement. the English habit of understatement, which is also caught up with Tolkien's habit of hyperbole. So we've got actually two almost paradoxically different habits of expression where Tolkien tended to downplay the things he cared about or his expertise, but he could be very hyperbolic about things that didn't even really matter. Or he had a sense of fun. And I think he liked doing a kind of theatrical, like, oh, I can't stand Dante. Dante is just the worst. When in fact, he actually was a member of the Oxford Dante Society and had written a paper on Dante, that kind of thing. And I came to realize that combination of understatement about the things he cared about, but overstatement about things that he was just being playful about, is so English. And it's a bit baffling for an American at times. And I think that's part of what Kilby was noticing. Like, he noted that Tolkien could say totally opposite things on different days, or just switch from one to the other. And I thought, I've seen that. I've seen my English friends do that. It's this sort of playful, mirror talk, and English people get that just fine, but Americans can have a hard time grasping it. And that again helped me to realize that part of the confusion of understanding Tolkien was that people were reading him totally literally. So when he would downplay something, they would say, oh, well, that didn't matter to him. And when he would be hyperbolic, they would say, oh, he hates that. Well, it's more complicated. It's considerably more complicated than that. And Kilby helped me to kind of put that piece into play.
All right, let's shift gears from the more general to the particular. We've been talking in general terms about Tolkien the man, Tolkien the reader. We've been talking about your new book, Tolkien's Modern Reading. But let's get down to the specific books that you cover in your book. That's kind of the meat of this volume, is you look at this almost staggering number of modern books that Tolkien read, talked about, wrote about, and then the next move is to show how they influenced a lot of Tolkien's enduring works themselves. Now, you did an extraordinary amount of digging into the books that Tolkien read. You spent time in libraries and research centers. I marvel, in the back of the book, readers are going to find this appendix, several pages long. I forget exactly how many, but it's a table essentially. And you collect all this data about each book that Tolkien had some sort of experience with, whether he mentioned it in his letters, whether he referenced it, whether he mentioned it in his speech or whatever. You focus your list on modern reading. You define modern as post 1850. So that's the sort of cutoff point. And you stick even just to English literature. So not even, books in other languages, which Tolkien would have obviously been well familiar with. You have 148 authors and over 200 titles that fit this categorization of modern English literature that Tolkien knew and recommended. Maybe give us a little sampling. I know you can't go into all of them, but what are some names and books that maybe people will be surprised to learn that Tolkien was familiar with and even enjoyed?
Yeah, and I would note too that the exciting thing about this is that 148 authors and 200 plus titles are all ones that I can say that he knew, that we know that he knew. He read them, he mentions them, he owned a copy of them. So again, we're not guessing here. So that means that there are, I am certain, hundreds and hundreds more that he read and knew that we just don't happen to have reference to yet. So it was startling to see the quantity of it. And then as far as surprises go, lots of them, and I'll just name a couple. One that surprised me was that he engaged with James Joyce. And this is an author, he's one of the prime modernists, and he kind of stands for everything you might assume that Tolkien was against. But I discovered that he had been involved with an Oxford student group that was very into modernist authors. I traced a connection, I think, between one of his poems and some things in Joyce, based on Tolkien's own notes that I looked at. And he wrote a bunch of notes about Joyce for a lecture that he was going to give. And it's interesting, too, that by looking very carefully at the context, I discovered that he had read Finnegan's Wake when Finnegan's Wake wasn't actually yet what we would call Finnegan's Wake. It was published first as a short excerpt, Anna Livia Pluribel, which he found interesting enough to transliterate into Elvish, that name. So he was interested in that. And the very fact that it's that bit that became Finnegan's Wake, he read it right when it came out. So that shows that he wasn't just waiting until a book had been out for decades and like, oh, everyone's talking about it, I might as well have a look. He was reading a book by one of the big modernists of his day, hot off the press, which says again something about his engagement with modern literature, even titles and authors that we might think that he would dislike. Now, did he, like everything that Joyce was doing? Definitely not. But he took it seriously enough to make these notes and to think about it. So that was one surprise. Another sort of whole category of surprises in a way was his engagement with just the entire genre of science fiction. He liked science fiction. He read a lot of different authors in it. He named, for instance, Isaac Asimov as a author that he admired, Ray Bradbury, another author that he admired, and he was quite pleased to be named a member of the American Science Fiction Writers Association. So that whole genre, again, he admired H.G. Wells, because science fiction has to do with technology and like rocket ships and stuff. At least we tend to think of it that way. And here's Tolkien very happily saying, "Oh yeah, this is good fun," and we can see an influence in the way that he had this famous wager with C.S. Lewis. It's called a wager, where they both were talking and saying, "Oh, there's just nothing of what we like, to read these days. We'll have to write some ourselves." And so Lewis set out to write a space travel story, and Tolkien to write a time travel story. And Tolkien, being Tolkien, never actually finished it. It's the lost road. It didn't get finished. This is very characteristically Tolkien. But what I think is most significant is, in order for him to say there isn't enough of what I like in science fiction, he had to be very well versed in the genre to say, I'm going to do a specific thing that they're not doing. So that was a bit of a surprise. Another kind of category was just all of the authors that are so completely forgotten today, because we remember, people like Joyce or C.S. Lewis, but there are so many authors who have disappeared without a trace. And I had to, no longer in print. I had to track down their books, through used bookstores. And one that was very significant for Tolkien is a book called John Inglesant by the author J.H. Shorthouse. And I'm going to hazard a guess that 99.9% or more of our viewers are going to say, Shorthouse, Inglesant, never heard of him. Well, nobody has, but he was hugely popular at the time. Even the prime minister was talking about this book. And Tolkien says it's very exciting and worth debating. And he even kind of draws a parallel between himself and the author. And I found that this book has themes of pity and mercy that I think we can trace some influence on The Lord of the Rings. But we wouldn't think of that, because who today has read John Inglesant? Me. And a few other people, but not many. So that was a surprise. And then I'll just give one more example of a surprise, and that was that he loved Beatrix Potter. He called her stories masterly. He had just high praise for her literary skill. And I just think that's delightful. What a mix from James Joyce to Isaac Asimov to Beatrix Potter. Here we have J.R.R. Tolkien's reading.
I've always had an image, a glamorous vision of academic work that maybe to use a Tolkien analogy, I always imagine that a researcher is like Gandalf going into some, dark tower of ancient libraries and blowing dust off of volumes and scraping cobwebs off forgotten manuscripts, and all of that results in some world-changing discoveries. What was your experience like as a researcher with this book? The couple of other books you've written, the first one was more of a memoir. The second one is apologetics. I'm guessing this one, the research was far more intense. You're in libraries and museums and things like that. Did you have any major aha discoveries or like, oh my goodness type moments during your research?
Well, relatively few, I must say, because mostly it was a question of accumulating many, many small mosaic pieces and then painstakingly putting them together. So it was really a question of massive patience and of exploring. So, for instance, I went to the Marion Wade Center in Chicago. It's a fabulous center for Inkling studies, and spent an entire afternoon going through Warren Lewis's unpublished diary pages in case there were any references to anything that Tolkien might have said that he had read. just page after page. You don't know if there's going to be anything. And you just keep going because you don't know. And then every now and then you'll find something that, well, is unexpected and cool. For instance, I was pleased to find in the archives of the Bodleian Library in Oxford, in the Weston Special Collections, an interview that Tolkien had done with a science fiction magazine in the 1960s that has never been reprinted. And it's not available online. I found a reference to it online, enough to say, I've never read this interview. I've never heard of this interview. I'm going to try and track down this interview. And because the Bodleian has this amazing collection of, even old science fiction magazines, I was able to hold this crackling, poorly printed 1960s, sci-fi magazine, and it had an extended interview with Tolkien in it that was totally eye-opening. It really gave insight into his views on science fiction, on technology, on the way that he approached his work, and from Tolkien himself, tucked away in a forgotten file, in the Bodleian. So that was one of the moments of kind of discovery. But there have been a lot of moments that have been just sort of personally quite moving. Even the fact of working in the Bodleian, because Tolkien went there. He did research in the Bodleian. Following in his footsteps, I went to Merton College and looked through the librarian's books there to see what books he'd checked out. I spent an entire afternoon in the Oxford Union's archives at the Oxford History Center, looking through the librarian's suggestion books for the Oxford Union Library, which Tolkien had been a member, and just kind of getting that sense of the time and the place that Tolkien had been, and getting a sense of him as a well-rounded person, as a young man in the Oxford Union Library, as a mature scholar in the Merton College Library, and then to have some moments like when I was in the British Library's special collections. I was looking through some of Tolkien's original letters, and there were some letters that were written on his birthday, and I was noticing the date. And then it occurred to me that it was, in fact, January 3rd. So I was looking at some letters written, on Tolkien's birthday that he had written on his birthday in the British Library. And I was really quite moved. It's hard to explain why, but I felt like a connection between myself and this man whose work I had been following. So lots of moments like that through the 10 years of working on this book.
So again, we're talking about Holly Ordway's brand new book. It is titled Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages. You can pick up your copy at wordonfire.org/Tolkien. Again, this has been many years in the making. We're so excited that this is the first volume in our new Word on Fire academic line. Couldn't be prouder to release this book by this author. Holly, in the new book, you have a whole chapter devoted to William Morris. William Morris. In fact, you begin that chapter by saying, and I'm quoting you, "Perhaps no other modern author has had as much impact on Tolkien's work as William Morris." Pretty bold claim. Now, Morris probably isn't necessarily a household name today, though, so give us a glimpse into who William Morris was and why he was so significant for Tolkien.
Yeah, William Morris is probably best known today for his arts and crafts designs, because he was kind of a man of many talents and he led the arts and crafts movement to try and recover, more beauty and craftsmanship in everyday life. So a lot of like wallpaper patterns, textile designs, really beautiful ones, came from Morris or his workshops. He also wrote a lot of poetry and a number of historical romances. So he was quite a prolific author. And in fact, he was even in the running to potentially be poet laureate. He wasn't picked as poet laureate, but he was a significant enough figure in that Victorian period that he could have been. Now he's fallen out of fashion today, and I think probably rightly so, because he's got a very distinctive style, and I don't think he has aged particularly well. It's very, very archaic. So he's a bit more forgotten today in terms of his writing, although his textiles have stayed famous. But for Tolkien, he encountered Morris's work as a young man. He had encountered one of Morris's retellings of the story of Sigurd, actually as early as when he was a boy. There's the story of Sigurd in the Red Fairy book, which Tolkien read as a child and was just struck by the dragon Fafnir, the most, powerful of all the dragon images that he encountered. It really stuck with him. And then we know that when he was undergraduate at Exeter College in Oxford, that he acquired several books by William Morris with some money that he won in a prize, one of them being The House of the Wolfings, which is one of the historical romances. And then we know from Tolkien's son Christopher that by the time, through Tolkien's life, he kept accumulating volumes by Morris, and he had, a dozen or so in his library. So this is a figure who's very, important to Tolkien and was important through his whole life. And we know specifically that he had an influence on Tolkien's writing because Tolkien says so. One point is that he names The House of the Wolfings and The Roots of the Mountains, another historical romance. He names those two books as an influence on The Lord of the Rings, directly so. And he also, in an early letter to Edith, who would become his wife, he commented that he had read The House of the Wolfings and that this mixed prose and verse style was giving him an idea that he wanted to try out for one of his own stories. So right there at the beginning of his kind of writing career, we find that Tolkien is even looking to Morris as a kind of model, saying he's doing this thing and I want to try it myself. And that's a form of influence. It's a very profound form of influence. And it's really interesting to trace how he reacts to Morris, because that first story, it's The Fall of Gondolin, that he writes inspired by Morris, sounds very much like Morris. It's full of archaism. It's just very, stilted and, what sayest thou and hie we hither and all that sort of thing. And then as time goes on, Tolkien matures stylistically, and he begins to look more critically at what it is that Morris is doing in terms of his use of language and his archaism, and to be much more conscious and deliberate about it. So by the time we get to The Lord of the Rings, we see him using touches of archaism, but in a much more sophisticated manner than Morris ever did. And using it to heighten tone and to, very selectively, whereas Morris is all the same. He has the same level of archaism through the whole book. So I think Morris is really interesting as a significant figure in Tolkien's reading, because we see how over time Tolkien kind of grapples with him, and he's influenced by him, but he doesn't copy him. He draws from it, draws what's good, says no to what isn't working. And again, this is Tolkien, the master writer, using his material as he goes.
Let's talk a little bit about Tolkien's relationship to American writers and poets. To me, this was another great revelation of your book. Tolkien never visited America himself, but he was surprisingly familiar with lots of American writers, poets, literary folks. We mentioned one earlier, the sci-fi writer Isaac Asimov, but maybe talk about some of these other figures Tolkien was familiar with from America.
Well, it's interesting to note, for instance, he said that he had read all of the writings of the American realist Sinclair Lewis, who wrote books like Babbitt, Main Street, things like that. And again, literary realism. And the fact that he said he had read all of them, I mean, even if we take that as a little bit of hyperbole, it still means he read a good many of Sinclair Lewis's books, which, again, in a very realist style, they're about as far from medieval literature as you can imagine. And he even notes that the name and character of Babbitt from Sinclair Lewis's book could have had an influence on the idea of the hobbits, which is fascinating. So we have possibly an American thread woven in there. He read Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the American poet. And as another surprise, he read Mark Twain. Again, not someone I would have thought that he would have read. And he even seems to have had a kind of cautiously positive view of T.S. Eliot. Now, I don't have much evidence of his engagement with Eliot, but he knew some of Eliot's work. He knew the four quartets. And when Eliot died, he noted in his letters that this was a sort of a melancholy thing. And he's very critical of the poetic elegy that John Masefield wrote for Eliot, It's just, and it's really a very kind of sappy sort of elegy. It's not fitting for Eliot at all, this modernist poet. And I think it's interesting that, Tolkien seems to have known Eliot's work and appreciated it enough to know that a kind of sentimental little verse just wasn't a fitting tribute for the man, who wrote The Wasteland. And again, this kind of surprised me because, for instance, C.S. Lewis really did not think well of T.S. Eliot. And so many people have just sort of lumped them together and assumed that, well, if Lewis didn't like someone like Eliot, surely Tolkien didn't either. Well, he seems to have had a more, qualified or cautiously positive view of him than we would have expected.
I can't help but think your book is like what many of us bibliophile types do when we go visit a friend's house and you walk into their living room and the first thing you do is kind of scan their bookshelves, right? And you think, if I could just note a few books here that I recognize, I could put together a pretty good picture of who this person is, what they're interested in, how their mind works, all that kind of stuff. So this book is like walking into Tolkien's library and kind of picking off little books, say, oh, wow, I didn't know you liked this. I didn't know you read this. But I think it's the second step of your book that it makes it far more interesting than just a tour of his library. And that's how many of these books shaped his writings. And in particular, The Lord of the Rings, the book that he's best known for. So maybe let's continue the thread of what books he liked and take it to the next step of where in Tolkien's Middle-earth writings do you see signs of influence from some of these modern sources? Can you give us a few examples?
Well, I can give you a few examples that Tolkien himself named, which I think is particularly interesting since people have assumed that he didn't have any influences, but we can even see some that he himself picked out. So there's a book, for instance, by E.A. Wicksmith called The Marvelous Land of Snurgs. And Tolkien loved this book, and he called it, and this is Tolkien's own words, an unconscious source book for the hobbits. And when you go and you look at The Marvelous Land of Snurgs, you find that the Snurgs themselves, these characters, are very Hobbit-like. And you can draw a parallel between them. But because Tolkien himself noted that it was an unconscious source book, we can be confident to say that some of those characteristics genuinely did contribute to the shaping of the hobbits as these childlike creatures. Another instance would be that Tolkien named George MacDonald's goblins as definitely source material for his own goblins in some quite interesting ways. Or we could look at the way that he named a book called The Black Douglas by S.R. Crockett. Again, another forgotten book. But he says that the warg scene from The Hobbits, where the wolves are, they're coming around and the hobbits go up the tree, that scene is derived from a scene in The Black Douglas. And it's really interesting, again, to look at it and say, oh, there is a parallel. And we know it's significant because Tolkien himself says that the scene was derived in part from that scene. And Tolkien gives a couple of names that had sources in his modern reading. So, for instance, the Mines of Moria, the word Moria, he got from the story Soria Moria Castle in a collection translated and edited by George Dasent. That name, he got it from there. And as another intriguing thing, he noted that the name Cracks of Doom was derived in part from a book by Algernon Blackwood. Now, he doesn't name the book in that comment, but I was able to figure out by the evidence that it is actually the book, The Education of Uncle Paul. So again, we have Tolkien naming a modern source for one of the most famous, landmarks in Middle Earth, the very cracks of fire in Mount Doom. So that's, very interesting to see the way that he's pulling very specific things from some of his modern reading and then transmuting them and transforming them into this creative new thing that he's doing with Middle Earth. And those are just some of the ones that he himself named and singled out.
There's many more throughout your book. I think in almost every section, every book, every author, you kind of tease out, well, maybe this could have influenced that, or this could have influenced that. So it's an amazing study to see how Tolkien's whole landscape was not just based on backward-looking sources. Tolkien was looking sideways at contemporary literature through his interest in science fiction. He's looking forward it makes Tolkien this much more capacious and expansive figure than just this stilted medievalist that's the common perception. Holly, let's close with this final question. Again, we're talking about Tolkien's modern reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages, your new book. I'm pretty confident this book is going to make a big splash in the world of Tolkien studies, mainly because it overturns a lot of these commonly held assumptions. But what would you say are some of the new doors that it opens up? What areas of Tolkien writing and scholarship do you think deserve more exploration as a result of what you found in this book? What's the next frontier for Tolkien studies, at least down this path?
Well, I hope anyway that it will encourage people to take seriously the question of what did he read of post-medieval literature. Now, as you noted earlier, I picked 1850 as my cutoff date because I had to have a cutoff date, or else I would never finish this book. I would become like Tolkien and have a book that was never finished. So I had to pick that cutoff date. But there are lots of interesting authors that he read that were before that. For instance, he read Jane Austen. His grandson remarked that he admired Jonathan Swift. So I think there's a lot of scope for people to investigate what had he read of that vast stretch between the end of the medieval period and 1850, which again, I think will help to shed light on the depth of his imagination. So if one thing I've done is to kind of open the door to look at his post-medieval reading, I say, let's look at those other areas as well. But I think a larger thing that I'm hoping for is that readers of Tolkien's modern reading will come away from it with a picture of Tolkien's creative imagination that's more complex, that's more nuanced, that his views in general were more nuanced. Like, I was surprised, for instance, to find that he kept up with the news. He was very interested in the news. He read 3 newspapers. I didn't expect this. This sheds some light on the way that he relates to the modern world. The fact that he had this depth of reading, that he had, for instance, surprisingly complex views on technology. Again, a surprise. I think if we can have this richer picture, it's going to help us understand his creative imagination better. And I hope that it will enable, future scholars to go back, first of all, to do more research, but also to read his works kind of with a more attentive eye and to recognize where maybe we brought some assumptions to the table that weren't doing Tolkien justice. And I hope we can really maybe appreciate even more fully just the amazing genius that he had. I mean, he's such a great genius as a writer and as a thinker. And now I think we can see even more so because there's even more sources that he's drawing on. So if I can help to complexify that portrait, I will be very pleased.
Well, Holly, thanks again for joining us. I want to encourage you watching this to pick up your copy of Holly's new book. Again, it's titled Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages. It was just published by the brand new imprint of Word on Fire titled Word on Fire Academic. You can get your copy at wordonfire.org/Tolkien. We're hoping this is going to be the first of many groundbreaking books in the new Word on Fire academic line. We've got several titles lined up in the realms of literature, philosophy, theology, spirituality, including some more books on Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, which we won't tip our hands here quite yet, but we encourage you to stay tuned for what's coming. Pick up your copy of the book. And thanks again to everybody for watching this interview with Dr. Holly Ordway.